Thank you very much to all of you. Good morning and good afternoon to those joining us from other time zones. Let me begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the School for Policy Analysis of the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and especially to Veronica Vinoradova and Maxim Yakovlev for this generous invitation. Also, I would like to thank Ivan Feshko for connecting me with you, and also my friend Leisa for being here. Thank you very much, Lesia, and please convey my greetings to the ambassador. Yes,
Yes, yeah, I'll
I really thank you
thank you,
very much.
thank
I
you,
really
Jesse.
appreciate it. And it is both an honor and a privilege to join you today and to share a number of reflection on a matter of profound international significance. So, as you can see in this slide, I have chosen to title my presentation Mexico and Latin America in response to the war in Ukraine from February 2022 to April 2026. In the first slide, you also can see my network's account. So please be in touch. I'll try to be as open as I can. So from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, it is a great pleasure to be in contact with all of you. So in the next slide, I would like to begin with a central proposition. From a Latin American perspective, the war in Ukraine cannot be understood merely as a European conflict. For our region, it has also served as a test of the resilience of international law, of the real authority of multilateralism, and of the capacity of Latin American states to defend legal principles without entirely surrounding the room for a strategic maneuver. Since February 2022, the Latin American response has not been uniform, yet it has displayed a recognizable pattern. At the normative level, there has been a broad condemnation of the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. At the political and strategic levels, however, there have been marked divergences once the discussion moves from principles to concrete instruments of response: sanctions, diplomatic pressure, military assistance, or even geopolitical alignment. So, this duality is essential because this duality precisely reminds us that support for the legal grammar of the international order doesn't necessarily translate into consensus over the policy instruments through which that order is to be defended. So, in the next slide, at the outset of the full scale invasion, Latin America's reaction at the United Nations was firmer than is sometimes recalled. On March 2, 2022, the General Assembly adopted the resolution entitled Aggression Against Ukraine by 141 votes in favor, 5 against, and 35 abstentions. And that outcome made clear that at the most basic level of charter law, Russian aggression was viewed by the overwhelming majority of the international community, including most Latin American states, as an inadmissible violation of territorial integrity and of the prohibition of the use of force. A few weeks later, on 24 March 2022, the Assembly adopted the resolution on the humanitarian consequences of the aggression by 140 votes in favor, 5 against, and 38 abstention. And once again, international support for Ukraine remained extremely broad. And taken together, these early votes demonstrate that Latin America, in general terms, of course, didn't stand outside the normative consensus, that the invention represented a grave rupture of the international legal order. In the next slide, and yet very soon, a second layer of the issue came into view. Once the debate shifted away from the general condemnation of aggression and toward more punitive, political, sensitive, or strategical decisive measures, the region began to fragment. Yes, and this was especially visible on April 7, 2022, when the General Assembly voted to suspend Russia from the Humanitarian Rights Council by 93 votes in favor, 24 against, and 58 abstentions. In Latin America and the Caribbean, most countries voted in favor, but there were also important abstentions and votes against, including those of Brazil, El Salvador, and Mexico. And that dispersion revealed a tension that could accompany the region throughout the conflict. Agreement in the abstract defense of sovereignty didn't automatically entail agreement on sanctions, diplomatic punishment, or proximity to the broader Western agenda. This is why so called Latin American neutrality should not be reduced to moral indifference. A more careful reading suggests something else. And from my own point of view, a diplomatic posture shaped by historical memory, by the long shadow of US interventionism, by an autonomous tradition in foreign policy, and by a persistent desire to preserve room for maneuver in an increasingly polarized international system. So, in that sense, neutrality in Latin America debate has often been less refusal of principles than a refusal of automatic alignment. In the next slide, in February 2023, on the first anniversary of the invasion or of the beginning of the war of aggression, the General Assembly adopted another resolution calling for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine by 141 votes in favor, 7 against, and 32 abstentions. And the message was unmistakable. Legal support for Ukraine's sovereignty remained robust. At the same time, it was increasingly evident that beneath that broad majority, there coexisted very different understanding of how peace should be pursued, what role external powers should play, how Europe's position should be interpreted, and whether viable negotiations could begin without the early inclusion of Russia. And this is an important point because a vote in favor of Ukraine's sovereignty didn't erase deeper disagreements over diplomacy, mediation, escalation, and the future architecture of peace. In the next slide, by 2024, this difference had become more visible and more structured. The summit on peace in Ukraine, held in Switzerland in June of that year, became, in effect, a diplomatic laboratory, if I could name like that, for observing Latin America's internal diversity. Argentina, under President Javier Milei, participated actively. Chile attended with President Gabriel Boric and clearly reaffirmed its commitment to territorial sovereignty and to the prohibition of the use of force. Mexico participated, led by then Foreign Minister Alicia Bárcena, but didn't endorse the final declaration. Brazil attended only as an observer and didn't sign it either. Colombia, for its part, chose not to participate, arguing that there was insufficient consensus around the proposed text. So the image that emerged from Switzerland was therefore highly revealing. Latin America was certainly not absent from the Ukrainian question, but neither did it act as a bloc. Rather, it presented a broad and differentiated spectrum of positions, ranging from explicit political support for Kiev to more inclusive, more skeptical, or more process oriented conceptions of diplomacy. So, that diversity is not incidental. It is one of the defining features of the regional response. So, in the next slide, I would like to talk very briefly about Brazil, because Brazil deserves particular attention because mediation became one of the most visible pillars of its diplomacy on Ukraine. Could we please transit to the next slide? Thank you. That's great. In May 2024, Brazil and China put forward a joint proposal calling for negotiations involving both Russia and Ukraine, as well as for an international conference recognized by both sides. Later, in September 2024, if I'm not wrong, President Lula once again defended the Chinese Brazilian initiative at the United Nations. In May 2025, he also spoke by telephone with Vladimir Putin in an effort to encourage Russian participation in the Istanbul talks with Ukraine. Whatever one's assessment of that initiative, and Kyiv was clearly critical of it, the Brazilian case illuminates one of the most characteristic Latin American responses to the war. Not alignment with Western pressure, but the assertion of an autonomous mediating role grounded in the premise that no settlement can be viable if one of the belligerents is simply excluded from the process. So Brazil thus embodies a wider regional instinct, the search for relevance through diplomacy rather than through alignment. In the next slide, the year 2025 altered the international context once again, and that shift matters greatly for understanding Latin America's position. On February 24, 2025, the General Assembly adopted a new resolution by 93 votes in favor, 18 against, and 65 abstentions. And the text reaffirmed the illegality of Russian aggression and the inadmissibility of recognizing territorial changes brought about by force as lawful, while once again invoking the idea of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Yet, the decline in support compared with 2022 and 2023 was significant. And this was not the only change the United States itself broke with the line it had maintained under the Biden administration and advanced a more neutral alternative text, while the Security Council adopted a US-sponsored resolution that didn't explicitly condemn Russia. In other words, by 2025, the debate over Ukraine was no longer structured exclusively as a tension between the West and the global South. It had also begun to reflect shifts within the Western position itself, most notably within the United States. And for Latin America, this made diplomatic calculation still more complex. Of course, the external landscape had become less stable, less predictable, and less normatively current. In the next slide, we will see that in 2026, that means in this year, in the fourth year of the invention, the General Assembly adopted yet another resolution by 107 votes in favor, 12 against, and 51 abstentions. And the text called for immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire, for the release of persons unlawfully detained, and for the return of civilians who had been interned or forcibly transferred, including children. And this is one of the most important effects of this war of aggression. The political significance of that vote is twofold. On the one hand, support for Ukraine recovers somewhat in comparison with 2025. But on the other hand, the international system continue to exhibit deep fractures, including the abstention of the United States. What 2026 revealed, therefore, was not the disappearance of the legal consensus surrounding the war, but rather the growing difficulty of translating that legal consensus into a stable geopolitical coalitions. The law remained clearer than the politics. And in the next slide, this broader regional picture must also include Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, because these three cases help identify the Latin American pole most distant from the Ukrainian position and to varying degrees most closely aligned with Moscow. From the outset of the full-scale invasion, Cuba and Nicaragua abstained on the 2 March 22 resolution condemning Russia aggression and calling for the withdrawal of Russian forces, while Venezuela didn't participate in the vote. The same broad pattern reappeared in the March 24, 2022 resolution on the humanitarian consequences of the war. Cuba and Nicaragua abstained, and Venezuela again didn't vote. The line current further on April 7, 2022, when the General Assembly suspended Russia from the Human Rights Council. Cuba and Nicaragua voted against, while Venezuela again didn't formally participate. Later, in the October 12, 2002 resolution declaring invalid the referendums organized by Russia and rejecting the annexation of Ukrainian territories, Nicaragua was one of the 5 votes against. Cuba abstained, and Venezuela was once again absent from the vote. In the Venezuelan case, however, the issue should be framed with caution. In addition to its political closeness to Moscow, Venezuela's position in the General Assembly at different moments during this period was also affected by questions related to the exercise of its voting rights as a consequence of errors in the payment of its financial contributions. But this pattern suggests that these were not isolated episodes, but elements of a relatively consistent diplomatic posture. In the resolution adopted on February 23, 2023, on the first anniversary of the invasion, Nicaragua again voted against, Cuba abstained, and Venezuela didn't participate. In the years that follow, the broader trend remained in place. Nicaragua continued to stand among the Latin America countries most clearly aligned with Russia, while Cuba remained outside the regional majority in support of Ukraine. And in 2026, in this year, both countries voted against the resolution calling for the immediate withdrawal of Russian troops, a ceasefire, and respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity. Analytically, it is therefore useful to distinguish 3 different situations. Nicaragua has represented the clearest and most consistent Latin American alignment with Moscow in the key resolutions. Cuba has oscillated between abstention and negative votes, but has remained outside the regional core that supports Ukraine. And Venezuela, although politically close to Russia, should be treated more cautiously in formal voting terms because its absence from several key votes makes it difficult to equate its conduct mechanically with that of Cuba or Nicaragua. It is, in the next slide, please, within this broader Latin American framework that Mexican case must be situated. Mexico was not an exemption to the regional pattern, but it did develop a particularly distinctive version of it. From the outset of the war, Mexico's position was structured around 4 relatively constant elements. First, condemnation of the Russian invasion as a violation of the United Nations Charter and of international law. Second, defense of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Third, rejection of unilateral economic sanctions. And fourth, refusal to send weapons combined with an insistence on a peaceful, negotiated, and inclusive solution. And this balance between legal principle and operational prudence has been the most stable feature of Mexico's position. In the next slide, as early as 2022, the Mexican government had already laid down these coordinates with notable clarity. On March 1st of that year, the then President Andrés Manuel López Obrador ruled out imposing economic sanctions on Russia. 3 days later, on March 4, he stated that Mexico would not send weapons to Ukraine. And on April 9, he again emphasized that Mexico didn't accept the Russian invasion, even while maintaining a line of operational neutrality and abstaining in the vote to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. And these decisions don't, from my point of view, of course, don't weaken the legal condemnation of aggression. Rather, they define the kind of response that Mexico consider compatible with its diplomatic tradition and with its own reading of the international order. Mexico's position, therefore, was never one of indifference. It was one of selective commitment, firm in legal terms, cautious in coercive ones. In the next slide, over the time, this line was not abandoned. On the contrary, it became more clearly formalized. The position paper of the government of Mexico for the 79 regular session of the United Nations General Assembly, issued in 2024, if I'm not wrong, expressly states that Russia's invasion of Ukraine constitutes an act of aggression and is therefore contrary to the United Nations Charter, of course, and to international law in general terms, and of course, against the most important principles of humanitarian international law. And the same document reaffirms respect for Ukraine's territorial sovereignty within its internationally recognized borders and maintains that a peaceful solution can only be achieved through inclusive dialogue between both parties. The same pattern was visible at the Swiss Peace Summit. Mexico participated, as I already mentioned, with a delegation led by Alicia Bárcena, but didn't sign the final communique. Mexico was among the states that withheld their endorsement alongside India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa. And the diplomatic meaning of that decision was not a shift in favor of Moscow, but the reaffirmation of a premise that Mexico consistently upheld throughout 2024. A sustainable peace requires a process conducted under United Nations parameters and involving all relevant parties, including Russia. In this sense, Mexico's refusal to endorse the communique didn't amount to a retraction of its condemnation of aggression. It was rather an objection to the political design of the proposed mechanism. In the next slide, I would like to talk about the level of General Assembly because Mexico's voting record confirms the consistency of that position. First, Mexico voted in favor of the resolution adopted in February 24, 2025 by 93 for votes, 93 votes in favor, 18 against, and 65 abstentions. The text, as I already mentioned, reaffirmed the legality of Russian aggression and the inadmissibility of recognizing territorial changes brought about by force as lawful. It also highlighted the human and humanitarian cost of the war and the need to move toward a solution consistent with international law. Second, Mexico voted in favor of the December 3rd, 2025 resolution on the return of Ukrainian children. And that text demanded the immediate return of Ukrainian children who had been unlawfully transferred or deported and called for international cooperation to facilitate their location, identification, and reunification with their families or legal guardians. Third, Mexico voted in favor of February 24, 2026 resolution that called for an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire and reaffirmed that a lasting peace must be grounded in the United Nations Charter and in full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It is also called for the release of persons unlawfully detained and the return of forcible transfer children, civilians, including, of course, children. And for all these reasons, to describe Mexico's position as a mere neutrality is inadequate. From my own point of view, Mexico has not been neutral in legal terms. It has supported key General Assembly resolutions that reaffirm Ukrainian sovereignty, condemn the aggression, and call for the conditions necessary for a just and lasting peace. Mexican caution lies in the instruments of coercion, not in the legal characterization of the conflict. And in the next slide, to understand the Mexican position fully, it is not enough to examine official statements and voting records. We must also consider public opinion. And here, a particularly revealing element emerged. Since 2022, Mexican public opinion has been clearly concerned about the war, but it has not been fully aligned with the dominant narrative frameworks found in Europe, for example. In February 2022, an El Financiero poll found that seven out of 10 Mexicans believed that the war would affect Mexico either greatly or somewhat, while 73% say they were very or somewhat worried about the situation between Ukraine and Russia. Shortly thereafter, a Mitofsky poll found that 76% believed the conflict would affect the countries either greatly or somewhat. 66% say they were very or somewhat concerned about the consequences in their own lives, and 58% consider it likely that the conflict could escalate into something resembling a world war. And what these figures suggest is that from the very beginning, the war was perceived in Mexico as geographically distant, yes, but far from irrelevant. Its economic and systemic consequences were clearly registered by the public. In the next slide, that concern didn't produce an absolute demonization of Russia, comparable to what could be observed in much of Europe. In March 2022, another El Financiero poll already showed a predominantly negative view of Vladimir Putin among Mexicans. 64% held an unfavorable opinion, while 16% held a favorable one. More recent international polling, however, suggests that Mexican public opinion is more complex and less polarized than the European one. According to Pew Research Center, in 2025, Mexicans still view Putin more negatively than positively. 34% express confidence in him, whereas 58% say they had no confidence in him. At the same time, Mexico appeared as the Latin American public with the highest relative level of confidence in the Russian leader among the countries from the region included in that study. And this doesn't mean that Mexican society is pro-Russian. It does mean, however, that it cannot be neatly captured by a framework of categorical and uniform rejection. And the next slide, I would like to mention one additional element that is particularly important for interpreting this ambivalence. In another Pew Research Center survey published in July last year, 68% of Mexicans identify the United States rather than Russia as the main country representing a threat to Mexico. And this finding doesn't directly indicate sympathy for Moscow. What it suggests, rather, is that the strategic imagination of a large part of Mexican public opinion continue to be structured around the relationship with Washington, around bilateral asymmetry, and of course, around the historical experience of living next to the United States. My reading is that this background helped explain why the war in Ukraine didn't generate a strong social pressure in Mexico in favor of a hard alignment with the West. For broad sectors of public opinion, the conflict was serious, yes, of course, but it was not the central axis of the country's perceived strategic insecurity. That is, of course, an inference drawn for the available data, not a mechanistic causal claim, but it is, I think, a plausible and useful one. In the next slide, and taken as a whole, the Mexican case may best describe as a form of normative pragmatism. At the level of principle, Mexico has been consistent. Russian aggression violates the United Nations Charter, Ukrainian sovereignty must be respected, and peace cannot be built upon the normalization of territorial conquest by force. At the level of instruments, Mexico has also been consistent, but in a different register. No unilateral sanctions, no arms transfer, yet to multilateralism, yes to dialogue and peaceful settlement, and of course, yes to inclusive negotiation. And this duality is not a contradiction. It is the specific way in which Mexico has sought to reconcile diplomatic tradition, strategic autonomy, and the defense of the international legal order. From a Latin American perspective, then, the war in Ukraine has functioned as something of a mirror. It has exposed the limits of simplistic categories, and the region has not been a pro-Russian bloc, nor has it been a Western bloc, and Mexico has not been an equidistant actor in any strict sense. What we have seen instead is a complex combination: adherence to the legal language of the Charter, distrust of rigid logics of alignment, defense of national autonomy, and a search for negotiated outcomes. In Mexico, that combination has been especially clear, and for that very reason, especially relevant for thinking about the country's place in the emerging international order. In this next slide, my conclusion on this topic is that between February 2022 and April 2026, Mexico has maintained a more clearly defined and more coherent position than is often acknowledged. It has condemned Russian aggression, defended Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, of course, supported key General Assembly resolution, insisted on the need for a just and lasting peace, and rejected unilateral mechanism of economic and military coercion. Mexican public opinion, for its part, has viewed the war as an important conflict with real consequences for the country, but has interpreted it through its own coordinates, shaped by Mexico's diplomatic history and by enduring centrality of its relationship with the United States. For that reason, rather than speaking loosely of ambiguity, it is more accurate to speak of a diplomacy of principles combined with operational prudence, embedded in a Latin American strategic culture that seeks to preserve international law without fully surrendering its autonomy. In my view, that is the most useful framework for understanding both Mexico and the region in relation to the war in Ukraine at this stage, especially in the decisive years of 2025 and 2026. Now, if you will allow me before concluding, I would like to briefly refer to another issue that has attracted particular attention. I am referring to the challenges Mexico faces in the field of security. In the next slide, this slide is fine, thank you. This issue shouldn't be understood only in terms of criminal violence. It must also be seen as a question of state capacity, institutional effectiveness, and the rule of law. The challenge remains significant. In 2024, 23.1 million people in Mexico were victims of crime. More than 9 out of every 10 crimes were either not reported or didn't lead to a formal investigation. And by the end of 2025, nearly two-thirds of the urban population still reported feeling unsafe in the city where they live. And these figures don't mean that Mexico is uniformly insecure, but they do show that the country continues to face deep structural problems in prevention, investigation, prosecution, and institutional trust. However, it is important to avoid simplistic or alarmistic interpretations. Mexico is not a country that can be described in uniform terms. Risks vary considerably depending on the region, the sector, and the type of activity involved. Some areas face particularly acute pressures linked to organized crime, logistics, and territorial disputes, while others remain comparatively stable. And this is why the discussion is not only about physical security, it is also about legal certainty, predictability, and the ability of public institutions to provide effective protection and credible enforcement. In the next slide, the economic dimension is also relevant. In 2023, the cost of insecurity and crime for business was estimated at more than 124 billion Mexican pesos, which illustrates that insecurity is not only a public order issue, but also a challenge for economic activity, investment conditions, and the normal functioning of markets. In that sense, the security question in Mexico affects not only citizens and communities, but also the broader environment in which national and international actors operate. In the next slide, and in response to this situation, the Mexican government has articulated a strategy built around four main pillars: addressing root causes, consolidating the National Guard, strengthening intelligence and investigation, and improving coordination with states authorities. Remember that Mexico is a federation. Officially, this strategy has been accompanied by specific measures, including, for example, a national anti-extortion strategy, targeted operations, and reported reductions in the daily average of international homicides since late 2024. And these developments deserve recognition. At the same time, a balanced assessment require us to note that the deeper challenge remains institutional. How to convert operational gains into lower impunity, a stronger local investigative capacity, and a greater legal certainty for society as a whole. In the next slide, it is also impossible to discuss security in Mexico without referring to cooperation with the United States. And this bilateral dimension is indispensable because the problem itself is transnational. Drug trafficking, armed trafficking, illicit financial flows, and cross-border criminal networks cannot be addressed effectively by one country alone. In recent months, both governments have reaffirmed their commitment to cooperation, including intelligence sharing, tracing technologies, joint investigations, and measures aimed, all of them, at reducing fentanyl traffic and the illegal flow of weapons. And yet, here too, one must remain both realistic and constructive. Cooperation exists, yes, but it is still needs to improve. Mexico has insisted quite reasonably that responsibility must be shared. The fight against criminal organization cannot focus only on what happens within Mexican territory. It must also include a stronger action in the United States against the southbound flow of firearms, against financial and commercial networks that facilitates illegal markets, and against the domestic demands that sustains drug trafficking. In other words, what is needed is not simply more bilateral rhetoric, but more effective, more balanced, and more verifiable cooperation. In the next slide, and to conclude,
Jose, I
Mexico
think,
security.
yeah, please, Jose, please, we'll kindly ask you from our Ukrainian team to wrap up because we have Dr. Aribel already waiting. Okay, so please.
Yes, this is my last slide. In conclusion, Mexico's security challenges are real, complex, and structural. They involve violence, certainty, but also institutional weakness, impunity, economic cost, and legal uncertainty. The Mexican state is seeking to address these problems throughout a broader and more coordinated strategy, and that is important. But in the medium term, the true measure of success will not be only whether some crime indicators decline, but whether the country can strengthen the rule of law, improve everyday security, and provide greater levels of both physical security and legal certainty. In the next slide, I just want to thank you, all of you, for your attention, and I remain open for question and for discussions. Thank you very much.